When a quiet loner rancher pays to hire a cook for the harsh winter, what he gets is more than he bargained for: a pregnant widow who brings unexpected grace and challenges his guarded heart. If you love stories of unexpected friendships, resilience, and second chances, make sure to subscribe to this channel and join us on this journey. The November wind cut through the Colorado plains like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Colton Hayes pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his shoulders as he made his way down the dusty trail, his boots stirring the dry earth beneath. The sun hung low behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the valley where his ranch sat. A solitary structure of weathered wood and persistence. He'd built it himself 17 years back, when the grief was still fresh enough to taste like ash in his mouth. Built it with hands that trembled from more than just the cold, in a place so remote that even the boldest visitors would think twice before making the journey. That was the point. A man didn't come to these plains looking for company. The letter in his coat pocket crinkled as he moved, its presence as foreign as an oasis in the desert. He'd picked it up from the general store in Red Rock 3 days ago, along with his winter supplies. Old Jenkins had handed it over with raised eyebrows that begged questions Colton had no intent to answer. "From Denver," Jenkins had said, tapping the envelope. "Fancy writing on it, too." Colton had merely grunted, shoving the letter away unread until he was well clear of town and prying eyes. Now, as he approached his ranch house, smoke already rising from the chimney thanks to the fires he'd banked that morning, he couldn't put off reading it any longer. The interior of the ranch house was sparse but clean. A single room with a loft for sleeping. A stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs he'd never needed. And shelves lined with preserved goods, dried meat, and the few books that had kept him company through lonely seasons. Everything a man needed. Nothing more. He hung his coat on the peg by the door, set his rifle in its place beside the fireplace, and finally drew out the letter. The paper was fine, too fine for these parts, and the script was indeed fancy. All loops and flourishes that spoke of education and Eastern manners. "Mr. Colton Hayes, as per your inquiry through our mutual acquaintance, Mr. Samuel Morrison, we have arranged for a suitable governess cook to arrive at Red Rock on the 15th of November. Miss Ella Mason comes highly recommended for her domestic skills and discretion. She understands the isolated nature of your residence and is prepared for the challenges of frontier living. The agreed-upon sum of $40 monthly should be paid directly to Miss Mason, who will manage her own expenses from this amount. She expects room and board, as discussed with appropriate arrangements for privacy and propriety. We trust this arrangement will prove satisfactory for the winter months ahead. Yours in service, Mrs. Adelaide Peaton, Domestic Agency, Denver." Colton stared at the letter, his jaw tightening. Samuel Morrison. He should have known that meddling fool would take his casual complaint about winter preparations and turn it into this. He'd mentioned, perhaps after one too many whiskeys, that the winters were getting harder to manage alone, that keeping the ranch running, the animals fed, and himself properly nourished through the harsh months was becoming a challenge gnawing at his bones. But he hadn't asked for a woman. Certainly hadn't asked for some Eastern governess with delicate sensibilities and fancy manners. What he'd had in mind was maybe a hired hand, some down-on-his-luck cowboy who could split wood and wouldn't expect conversation. The 15th. That was today. He crumpled the letter, then smoothed it out again. $40 a month was steep, but not unreasonable. He had the money. Years of cattle drives and occasional guide work had built up a decent sum, hidden in the coffee tin behind the loose stone in the fireplace. Money meant nothing out here anyway. Couldn't eat it or burn it for warmth. He moved to the window, peering out at the trail that led down to Red Rock. It would take most of the day for someone to make the journey up, assuming they found someone willing to guide them. Assuming this Miss Mason didn't take one look at the plains and catch the next stage back to Denver, that would be best. He decided he'd go down to town in a few days, explain there had been a misunderstanding. Morrison could mind his own business, and Colton could go back to his solitude. The ranch had been enough for him these 17 years. It would be enough for 17 more. But as the day wore on, Colton found himself making small preparations despite his resolution. He cleared the accumulated gear from the small lean-to room he used for storage, swept out the dust and mouse droppings. He checked the stove in there, a smaller thing he'd installed years ago with some vague notion of eventually needing the space. It worked, though it smoked a bit. By afternoon he'd brought in extra wood, filled the water barrels, and even taken the time to patch a hole in the roof of the lean-to where the wind had been whistling through. All practical things, he told himself, things that needed doing anyway. The sun was beginning its descent behind the western hills when he heard it, the distant sound of horses on the trail. Colton stepped out onto the porch, his breath misting in the cold air. 2 figures on horseback were making their way up the final stretch, one clearly a local guide by the way he sat his horse. The other was bundled so thoroughly against the cold that Colton couldn't make out much beyond the fact that she was small and rode like someone who'd learned on eastern bridle paths rather than ranch trails. The guide, it looked like young Tom Bradley, was leading a pack mule loaded with what appeared to be luggage. Too much luggage for a winter's work. They reached the ranch as the last light was fading. Tom swung down from his horse with the easy grace of youth, then turned to help the woman dismount. She moved slowly, carefully, one hand pressed to her middle as she found her footing. "Mr. Hayes," Tom called out, his voice carrying that nervous edge young men got around their elders. "Brought Miss Mason up from town like she asked." Colton remained on the porch, watching as the woman straightened, pulling back the hood of her traveling cloak. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 26, with dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, and a face that might have been pretty if it weren't drawn with exhaustion. Her eyes, when they met his, were gray as the winter sky, and she was with child. The swell of her belly was unmistakable now that she stood facing him, her cloak falling open to reveal the clear evidence of pregnancy. Far along by the look of it. Months, not weeks. "You're Miss Mason." The words came out rougher than he'd intended. She lifted her chin, a gesture that spoke of pride despite her obvious weariness. "Mrs. Mason," she corrected, her voice carrying a slight tremor that might have been from the cold. "I'm a widow." Tom was already unloading the pack mule, setting bags and a small trunk on the porch with hurried movements that suggested he wanted to be gone before full dark. Smart boy. The agency said nothing about, Colton gestured vaguely, his mind racing. "About my condition." Ella Mason's voice gained strength, though he could see her swaying slightly on her feet. "I informed Mrs. Peaton. She assured me it would not be an issue, given that I would not require wages until after my confinement, after—" She took a breath. "The baby will come whether you approve or not, Mr. Hayes." There was steel in her voice now despite her exhaustion. "I can work until my time, and after. I'm asking only for shelter and food in exchange for my labor. The arrangement stands as agreed." Tom cleared his throat, already back on his horse. "I'll be heading back now, Mr. Hayes. Gets dark quick on the trail." He tipped his hat to Ella. "Ma'am," and then he was gone, the sound of hooves fading into the gathering darkness, leaving Colton alone with a pregnant widow and the growing certainty that his carefully ordered world had just been upended. "I didn't pay for this," he said finally, the words harsh in the cold air. "I didn't pay to feed too." Ella Mason drew herself up straighter, though he could see the effort it cost her. Her hands moved protectively to her belly, but her eyes never left his face. "The baby will come whether you paid for it or not," she said quietly. "I can work. I will work. But if you're going to turn me out, do it now while there's still light enough to walk back down the trail." The challenge hung between them in the frigid air. Colton could see her trembling, whether from cold or exhaustion or sheer determination, he couldn't say. The practical part of him, the part that had survived 17 winters alone, knew she'd never make it down the trail in the dark. The path was treacherous enough in daylight. and beneath that, buried deep where he tried not to look, was the memory of another woman standing in the snow, heavily pregnant, laughing as she threw snowballs at him while their son toddled between them on unsteady legs. "Get inside," he said gruffly, turning away. "The lean-to room has a stove. You'll freeze standing out here." He heard her pick up one of her bags, her movement slow and careful. When he glanced back, she was struggling with the weight, one hand supporting her belly while the other gripped the handle. Without a word, he stepped down and took the bag from her, then grabbed the trunk as well. She followed him into the ranch house, and he was aware of how she paused in the doorway, taking in the sparse interior, the lonely table with its 2 chairs, the narrow space that had been home to only him for so many years. "Through here," he said, leading her to the lean-to room. It was small but clean now, with a narrow bed, the smoking stove, and a few hooks on the wall for clothing. "You'll take your meals in the main room. Privy's out back. There's a path." She nodded, setting down the small bag she still carried. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." He grunted, already backing toward the door. "Supper's at sundown. You missed it today. But there's bread and cold meat on the shelf. Help yourself." "I can cook tomorrow," she offered quickly. "That's why I'm here. I'm a good cook, Mr. Hayes. You won't regret—" "We'll see." He cut her off, then paused in the doorway. "What happened to your husband?" Something shifted in her face, a closing off that he recognized. "He died," she said simply. 6 months ago." 6 months, and her far along enough that the child must have been conceived. He did the calculation and felt something twist in his chest. A widow indeed, carrying her dead husband's child, alone in the world and desperate enough to answer an advertisement for work in the middle of nowhere. "Get some rest," he said gruffly. "Work starts early here." He closed the door between them, leaving her to settle in, and moved to his chair by the fire. The flames crackled and spit, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the plains with a sound like morning. Colton Hayes sat alone in his ranch house that wasn't quite empty anymore, and wondered what in God's name he'd just done. The morning came early and cold, frost painting elaborate patterns on the ranch house windows. Colton was already up, had been for an hour, stoking the fire and preparing for the day's work. He moved quietly out of habit, though he caught himself listening for sounds from the lean-to room. Nothing. The woman was either still asleep or lying awake in silence. He set the coffee pot on the stove and was slicing bacon when the door opened. Ella Mason stood there, dressed in a plain brown dress and apron, her hair already pinned up neatly despite the early hour. The shadows under her eyes spoke of a restless night, but she moved with purpose. "I'll do that," she said, stepping toward the stove. "Coffee's nearly ready," he replied, not moving aside. "Bacon goes in the pan when it's hot enough to spit." "I know how to cook bacon, Mr. Hayes." There was no sharpness to her words, just a quiet statement of fact. He studied her for a moment, then stepped back, handing her the knife. She took his place at the stove, with an economy of movement that spoke of long practice. Despite her condition, she worked efficiently, slicing the rest of the bacon, setting it to sizzle in the cast-iron pan, then reaching for the egg basket without being told where it was. "How many eggs?" she asked. 3, he paused. 4. "You need to eat." She nodded, cracking eggs one-handed into a bowl while keeping an eye on the bacon. He noticed she held her other hand against her lower back, a gesture he remembered from before. They ate in silence, sitting across from each other at the table that had only known one place setting for 17 years. Ella ate steadily but slowly, as if each bite required consideration. When she finished, she immediately began clearing the dishes. "I'll need to know your routine," she said, pumping water into the wash basin. "What time you prefer meals? What foods you favor? Any particulars about the household?" "Sunup, noon, sundown for meals. I'm not particular about food. Whatever keeps a man going." He pulled on his coat. "There's a root cellar out back. Smokehouse, too. Chickens in the coop need feeding, eggs gathering, 2 milk cows in the barn." She nodded, hands deep in the soapy water. Any washin' that needs doing? I manage my own. I see. She dried her hands on her apron, turning to face him. And what would you have me do between meals, Mr. Hayes? I'm here to work. He looked at her, this small woman with her swollen belly and tired eyes, standing straight-backed in his kitchen as if she weren't carrying a burden that would have sent most women to their beds. Do what needs doing, he said finally. Just don't overdo. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, or relief. I won't. He left then, escaping to the familiar world of outdoor chores. The animals needed tending, wood needed splitting, the endless tasks that filled a man's days on the plains. But he found himself working closer to the ranch house than usual, keeping an ear out for, what? Signs of distress? The crash of dishes? He didn't know. What he heard instead was singing, soft, almost under her breath, a melody he didn't recognize, carrying on the thin prairie air. He paused in his wood splitting, axe raised, listening despite himself. The song stopped abruptly, as if she'd caught herself, and the silence that followed seemed heavier somehow. When he came in for the noon meal, the ranch house had been transformed. Not dramatically, his few possessions remained where they'd always been, but the surfaces were clean, the windows cleared of their film of dust, and the whole place smelled of soap and something else, fresh bread. Ella was pulling a loaf from the oven, her face flushed from the heat. I hope you don't mind, she said without turning. I noticed you had flour and starter, seemed wasteful not to use it. The bread was perfect, golden crusted and steaming when she cut into it. She served it alongside a thick stew made from dried meat and root vegetables he hadn't even remembered he had. They ate in the same silence as breakfast, but it felt different somehow, less strained. Where did you learn to cook? He asked finally. She looked up, seeming surprised by the question. My mother, mostly. Then later. She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. I kept house for the minister's family in town before I married. What town? Lawrence in Kansas. He knew of Lawrence, had heard stories. Rough place. Yes. The single word carried weight. They finished the meal without further conversation. She began clearing again, and this time he helped, carrying his own dishes to the wash basin. Their hands brushed as she took them from him, and she pulled back as if burned. I can manage, she said quickly. He retreated to his chair by the fire, pulling out his knife and a piece of wood he'd been whittling. It was meant to be a horse, though it looked more like a misshapen dog at the moment. He worked at it while she moved about the ranch house, aware of her presence in a way that made his hands clumsy. As the afternoon wore on, he noticed her movements becoming slower, her hand pressing more frequently to her back. When she reached for something on a high shelf and swayed slightly, he was on his feet before he thought about it. Sit, he ordered, guiding her to the other chair by the fire. I'm fine, she protested, but she sank into the chair with obvious relief. When's your time? The question came out more bluntly than he'd intended. She colored slightly. 2 months, perhaps a bit more. It's hard to know exactly. 2 months, dead of winter. The nearest midwife was in Red Rock, a day's journey in good weather. Impossible if the snows came heavy. You have experience with birthing? She asked quietly, reading his thoughts. Cattle. Horses. He paused. Once, a long time ago. He didn't finish, couldn't, but she seemed to understand, nodding slowly. I'll manage, she said, echoing her earlier words. Women have been having babies in harder places than this. Not alone. She met his eyes steadily. Am I, Mr. Hayes? He looked away first, uncomfortable with what he saw in her gaze. Trust, maybe, or hope. Both things he'd forgotten how to handle. Load brought the full fury of winter to the Colorado plains. Snow fell in sheets, driven by winds that howled across the open country like banshees. The ranch house, built solid and true, weathered the storms, but the isolation became complete. No visitors, no contact with Red Rock, just the two of them and the growing child that Ella carried. She worked steadily through the cold months,
though he insisted she rest more as her time approached. He took over the heavier chores without being asked, hauling water, feeding the stock, splitting wood. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, and slowly, carefully, they built a routine that felt almost natural. It was during one of the worst storms, when the wind screamed around the ranch house and snow piled against the windows, that everything changed. Colton woke to the sound of soft crying from the lean-to room. Not the tears of immediate pain, but the deep, grieving sobs of someone remembering loss. He lay in his loft listening, his instinct warring between retreat and comfort. Quietly, he climbed down and moved to the stove, brewing tea with the dried herbs Ella had organized in his stores. When it was ready, he poured a cup and added a precious spoonful of honey. He didn't knock on her door, just set the cup outside it along with 2 biscuits left from supper. When he came back an hour later, the cup was gone. Ella was at the stove, her face composed, though her eyes were red-rimmed. She didn't mention the tea, and neither did he. But that evening, his favorite shirt, the one with the frayed cuffs, appeared on his chair, mended with tiny, careful stitches. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, Colton was sitting by the fire, unable to sleep. The sound was quieter, but in the still night air it carried. "Ella?" His voice was rough from disuse. "You all right in there?" Abruptly. For a long moment there was silence. Then, so quiet he almost missed it. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." He pressed his palm against the door. Do you want to talk?" Another long silence. Then the door opened a crack. Ella stood there in her nightdress and shawl, her hair in a long braid, looking younger and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. Her hand rested protectively on her belly. "I dream about him sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"My husband, Daniel. I dream he's still alive, that none of it happened. Then I wake up and remember."
Colton nodded slowly.
How did he die?
She moved past him to the main room, settling carefully in the chair by the fire. He added another log, then took his own seat, waiting.
"He was a printer,
She began, staring into the flames.
had his own small press in Lawrence. He believed in things, in justice, in truth. Said it was a printer's duty to spread both.
A bitter smile touched her lips.
He printed pamphlets about the railroad companies, about how they were stealing land from farmers, forcing them out with false deeds and hired guns.
Confiscated when this was going, had seen it play out in too many frontier towns. The railroad men came one night, said he had to stop printing his lies or they'd stop him permanent. Daniel, her voice caught. Daniel told them the truth wasn't lies. They beat him right there in our shop, broke his presses, burned his papers. The sheriff arrested him for disturbing the peace. Can you imagine? They beat him half to death, and he was the one arrested. Kang's hands clenched in her lap. He died in that jail cell 3 days later. Internal injuries, the doctor said, though he wouldn't put it in writing. I tried to get justice, tried to get anyone to listen, but the judge was in the railroad's pocket. The whole town was. They made it clear I should leave. Made it very clear. So you answered an advertisement for a cook in the Colorado Plains. She looked up at him then, eyes bright with unshed tears. I had nowhere else to go. My family disowned me when I married Daniel. He was beneath me, they said. His family was all back east, and with the baby coming. She shrugged, a gesture of such profound helplessness that it made his chest tight. Wolfgang in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Colton spoke. My boy was 9. The words came hard, like pulling splinters from old wood. Samuel, strong boy, smart, had his mother's eyes and her way of finding joy in everything. The fever came through in '68, took half the county. We thought we were safe out here, away from town. We weren't. Ragazier, seeing faces in the flames. He went first. 3 days of burning up while we tried everything. Cold baths, willow bark tea, prayers I didn't even believe in. Nothing helped. Ella made a soft sound of sympathy, but he couldn't look at her. Margaret. She held him while he died. Wouldn't let go even after. had to pry him from her arms to bury him, his voice roughened. She followed him a week later, same fever, but I think she just didn't want to fight it, didn't want to stay in a world without him. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now. Not the careful silence of strangers, but the shared quiet of two people who understood that some pain was too deep for words. I talk to Daniel sometimes, Ella admitted softly. Tell him about the baby moving, about the planes, about you. Is that foolish? No more foolish than a man who still sets two plates sometimes without thinking. She reached out then, her small hand covering his where it rested on the arm of his chair. Her touch was warm, alive, a reminder that not everything in the world was memory and ghost. We're a pair, aren't we? She said with a watery smile. Two broken people hiding on the plains. Maybe broken people can help each other heal, he said, the words surprising him as much as her. She squeezed his hand gently before withdrawing. Maybe they can. When her time came in February, during the worst blizzard Colton had seen in years, he was ready. The medical book, Margaret's father's old volume, had been studied until the pages were worn. Clean cloths were prepared, water kept hot, instruments sterilized. The labor was long and difficult. Ella worked with the same quiet determination she brought to everything, only crying out when the pains became unbearable. Colton stayed with her, letting her grip his hands until his fingers went numb, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement when she faltered. I can't, she gasped at one point, exhausted and trembling. I can't do this. Yes, you can, he said firmly. You're the strongest woman I know, Ella Mason. You survived losing your husband, traveled alone to the plains, made a home in a stranger's house. This is just one more challenge to overcome. When the baby finally came, a healthy boy with strong lungs and his mother's dark hair, Colton felt something break open in his chest, something that had been frozen for 17 years. He's perfect, Ella whispered, cradling the infant against her breast. Oh, Colton, he's perfect. She'd used his first name without thinking, and the sound of it in her voice made his throat close entirely. What should we name him? She asked softly. That's for you to decide. To call him Samuel, she said quietly, if that's all right with you. New life from old sorrow, maybe a way of honoring what was while hoping for what might be. Samuel's a good name, he managed, a strong name. Samuel Daniel Mason. She looked up at him, eyes bright with tears, and something else. Something that looked like love. Thank you, Colton, for everything. As spring arrived and the snow melted, revealing the garden plot Ella had planned all winter, changes came to the ranch. The townspeople of Red Rock, initially suspicious of the arrangement, gradually accepted the unusual family. Reverend Harper visited regularly, blessing their home and the child. Even the stern merchants who'd once whispered about propriety came to respect the quiet dignity of their partnership. They were married in June, in the small church in Red Rock. Not from necessity now, but from choice. From love that had grown slowly, carefully, like prairie grass after rain. Take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife. Unforesaid. Do you, Ella Mason, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. The kiss that sealed their vows was gentle, but real, holding promise and hope and the certainty of all the years to come. Little Samuel, now 4 months old and the darling of the congregation, chose that moment to voice his approval with a happy shriek that set everyone laughing. A year later, as Ella worked in the garden she'd planted with such care, one hand resting on the swell of their second child, Colton watched from the porch and marveled at the transformation. The ranch that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with life. Samuel's laughter, Ella's singing, the sounds of a home where people lived rather than merely existed. "Papa!" Samuel called, toddling toward him with the determined concentration of a child learning to walk. "Up!" Predatory scooped him up, settling the boy on his shoulders. His son, not by blood perhaps, but by choice and love and every day they'd spent together. "See your mama in the garden?" he asked, pointing to where Ella knelt among the vegetables, her face turned up to the sun. "She's growing food for us and flowers to make everything pretty." "Mama!" Samuel shouted, waving chubby hands. Ella looked up and smiled. that transformative smile that had first cracked Colton's frozen heart. She rose carefully, one hand supporting her back, and walked toward them. "What are my men up to?" she asked, reaching up to ruffle Samuel's hair. "Teaching him about the ranch," Colton replied, his free arm encircling her waist. "About how things grow when they're tended with care." She leaned against him, solid and warm and real. "Some things," she said softly, "grow even when you think they can't, even when you think you've forgotten how." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the distant hills, Samuel sleeping between them, Ella spoke of the future. "I've been thinking about names," she said, her hand resting on her belly. "Boy or girl?" "Either way." She smiled. "I was thinking, if it's a girl, maybe Margaret, after your wife. And if it's a boy—" She paused. "What was your father's name?" "William." The word came out rough with emotion. "William Hayes." "Samuel Daniel and William Hayes," she mused. "It has a good sound." Colton pulled her closer, marveling at how completely his world had changed. The loner rancher who'd paid for a cook had received so much more: a family, a future, and the grace to love again. "Yes," he said quietly, "it sounds like home." And as the stars emerged in the vast Colorado sky, three souls who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances settled into the peace of belonging. The ranch that had sheltered one man's solitude now held a family's dreams, built on the foundation of shared sorrow and the miracle of second chances. Thank you for listening to our story today. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps on a long drive? Please subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and connections make our community special.